Good afternoon. My name is David Azarad, and on behalf of the Heritage Foundation, I would like to welcome you to this Russell Kirk lecture on Modern Liberalism and America's Racial Divide by Shelby Steele. A little over 2 years ago, the geniuses at Starbucks, who were not content with merely selling us their overpriced coffee-like concoctions, decided that they should also spur a national conversation on race. Because as we all know, race is the issue that most naturally lends itself to casual banter with the barista you don't know while surrounded by strangers in a public space. Not surprisingly, at least to everyone not named Howard Schultz, the Race Together campaign was universally derided and Starbucks was forced to abandon it within a week. If there is one thing that all Americans know, is that race is the one issue you cannot talk about in this country. Or to be more precise, you can talk about it so long as you stick to the scripted platitudes of identity politics. It requires considerable courage to say or even think otherwise. As our speaker today once observed, each race has its politics and its party line that imposes a certain totalitarianism over the maverick thoughts of the individual. Shelby Steele is one such maverick. Over the course of a distinguished career as one of America's leading public intellectuals, he's demonstrated considerable courage in speaking frankly and truthfully about race. As the Robert J. and Marion E. Oster Senior Fellow at Stanford University's Hoover Institution, he's written widely on race relations in America. He's been awarded the National Humanities Medal as well as a Bradley Prize. Before joining Hoover in 1994, he taught English literature at San Jose State University for almost 2 decades, before being driven out of his department for publishing this book, The Content of Our Character, A New Vision of Race in America. The book did earn him, however, the National Book Critics Circle Award in the general nonfiction category. Steele has since published 4 more books, including White Guilt, How Blacks and Whites Together Destroyed the Promise of the Civil Rights Era, and A Dream Deferred, the second betrayal of black freedom in America. What makes Steele such an interesting and insightful writer is that he looks at race not through the prism of race, but through the prism of human nature. He's a masterful psychologist who knows the dark recesses of the human soul. As he once explained in an interview, quote, "The mistake everybody makes when they look at race is to look at race. You'll never get anywhere that way. I try to bring universal insight on the human condition to bear on what is, in a historical sense, a local situation." End quote. Please join me in welcoming Shelby Steele to the Heritage Foundation.
Wow, thank you. That sounds good. Sit down now. Well, thank you, and thank you for inviting me to do this lecture. I think I did it once before, but it's been a very long time, so it's good to be back here at Heritage. I want to talk about modern liberalism and the racial divide, and I want to start with a distinction that I think is important to make always. I won't be talking about classic liberalism, classical, the kind of liberalism that comes down to us from the Enlightenment and through John Locke and the Founding Fathers in America, and the liberalism that today is often called conservatism. I count myself in that under the flag of that kind of liberalism, but I'm talking about what I think a little facetiously call Madame Bovary liberalism, and which came, I think, directly out of the 60s, did not really exist until the 1960s, but has dominated our culture ever since, it seems to me. The arc of Madame Bovary's life, you know, this is the French novel by Gustave Flaubert, and Madame Bovary is seen as the sort of first modern character and modernist character in all of literature. because she is not driven by the usual motivations of money and so forth. She's driven by a kind of angst, a dissatisfaction with her life. She finds herself living in the provinces in France, in a little village, a kind of a backwater. She's married to a country doctor who loves her dearly, but who is a kind of ordinary fellow, a little boring, but a decent guy. Madame Bovary, on the other hand, feels that she is better than this, and that she, in that sense, puts herself above her fate, which is to live in this sort of ordinary world, and she begins to sort of project idealisms onto the world, visions of a perfect love, a perfect romance, high life in Paris, hotels, lavish dinners, beautiful clothes, and so forth. And she begins to sort of rob Peter to pay Paul, and to pay for all of this, because she begins to act it out. She takes on lovers and so forth. Then, of course, the house of cards finally collapses, and she can no longer borrow from Peter to pay Paul. Her lovers reject her, see her as a nuisance. She comes home one night, takes a handful of arsenic, and administers it to herself, and dies a rather wretched death. And so she is, in that sense, a tragic figure, and her story represents, her arc represents a tragedy, in the sense that there was this magnificent idealism that was so seductive and so charming, and then there was reality that was just plain old reality, and she was unable to accommodate. Well, keeping the arc of her life in mind, let's look at modern liberalism. I believe that this liberalism was born of a profoundly transformative moral fall that occurred in America in the 1960s, that America endured. From a vision of itself as a great and fair nation, there was a fall to a certain knowledge of its dark underside. In the 60s, I think it was the civil rights movement that sort of started this off, this fall. My family was involved in that movement, the founding members of CORE, and I remember the philosophy of the civil rights movement was nonviolent, passive resistance, and you went to demonstrations. You had to pass a test. You had to you had to wear a tie if you were male. You had to wear a dress if you were a female. You had to agree to not respond to violence, because the point was, if you were hit, if you were struck, if you were attacked in some way, your passive resistance was a moral witness of society. And of course, everybody's seen the picture of blacks marching across Edmund Pettus Bridge into this bank of police dogs and water cannons and billy clubs, and women are mowed down and men are beaten. John Lewis was among them. And then, of course, the next morning, in Paris, in Tokyo, in Stockholm, everywhere in the world, photographs of these people being assaulted in this way were there for everybody to see. And it made the statement, here is evil. Here is human beings being profoundly inhuman to people who are doing nothing more than asking for freedom. They didn't want affirmative action then. They didn't want larger welfare payments. They didn't want school busing. They didn't want all of the other mechanisms of liberalism that came later. They just wanted freedom, and for this, they were beaten. Well, you add to the civil rights movement the women's movement. Women took only until it was not until the 20th century that women got to vote. Vietnam, of course, was a profound cultural event in the 60s, and showed a kind of arrogance of power on the part of America. Oh, we'll contain communism over here, and we'll in this little country. And of course, 14 years later, and 57,000 American lives lost, we lost the war on top of it. So this great America that had won World War II, again, had some chinks in its reputation, and this became a part of the fall. The sexual revolution, the revolution against bourgeois sexual repression and so forth. The hippies, one movement after another said that there was something wrong with America. All of this dissent gave birth to what I think is a brand new idea that had not been a part of American life and culture before this time. And that idea was that America was guilty of characterological evil. That is to say, it wasn't a country that just now and then responded to evil or acted in that way. It was a country in which evil was endemic, was a part of the character, was a means of doing business in society. It was as American as apple pie. Well, this was a brand new idea in the 1960s. And it, again, shattered this sort of vision of us as this singular vision of us as a great country, a great power, a great and good people. No, maybe great, but not good. And modern liberalism, it seems to me, is born very specifically as a response to this new idea of characterological evil. It's not an economic liberalism, it's not an historical liberalism, it's a moral liberalism designed to respond in some way to this moral fall. So in that sense, it is a liberalism of redemption. Its purpose was to redeem America, to bring us, to have us in some way overcome the shame of our evil. There are many effects of this liberalism, but I will mention just two. And the first is that the idea of American evil calls up bad faith, what I call bad faith. What is bad faith? It is a disbelief in authority, a skepticism, a cynicism about the legitimacy, the moral legitimacy of the authority under which we are asked to live and to be citizens. And bad faith, it seems to me, came out of this new liberalism. And if American evil, in that sense, makes also a virtue out of bad faith. If America's evil, it is virtuous to have bad faith and to be suspicious and cynical and mistrustful of American authority, of America's moral legitimacy. This is how we arrived, I believe, or this is how this liberalism arrived, at the idea that anti-Americanism, which is sort of a quintessential bad faith, the extreme example of bad faith, how anti-Americanism becomes redemptive and even progressive. And conversely, the explicit patriotism joins us to American evil. And so if you are running around with an American flag and the sort of emblems of happy patriotism, it is because you are in league with the old characterological evil. You're reflecting it. If you are disbelieving in those symbols, if you're an NFL football player and you don't want to stand for the national anthem, you're on the side of the good. You are progressive. You are standing against this evil. Universities today effectively promote bad faith in America, promote anti-Americanism as a way to better the world, as progressivism itself. I once had an encounter with bad faith. I've had many, but one was a little more interesting than some others. In 1971, I flew to Algiers, Algeria, to meet with the Black Panthers, who were living there in exile, on the run from American authorities. My young wife, American Jewish lady, accompanied me. Says something about how smart we were at 22, 23. But we both, I think, wanted to see what these Panthers were really all about. I had grown up in segregation. I knew it intimately. My elementary school was the first desegregation lawsuit in the North. My parents were involved throughout my childhood in civil rights activities of one kind or another. But as I began to go to junior high school in the late 50s, early 60s, I began to feel a sort of mounting militancy, a sense of, now why is it that I can't cross the threshold when I want to buy an Italian roast beef and pepper sandwich, and I have to stand outside the door and give them my money and hope they come back quick and give me my, why do I have to do that? And a thousand other sort of examples of that. And so I began to sort of feel a mounting militancy. I read James Baldwin, Notes of a Native Son. Baldwin's magnificent indignation at American injustice and so forth began to infect me. By the time I was in high school, I had what I call the sort of Martin Malcolm shift, where you move from admiring Martin Luther King to admiring Malcolm X. Martin Luther King was passive resistance. Malcolm X was it by any means necessary. He also had another message that gets lost today, self-help. He didn't want anything from the government. He wanted blacks to do it on their own. But anyway, he became the sort of, in other words, I was during this time learning bad faith, learning to doubt my country. It was a very sane thing to begin to experience. And so when I went to Algiers, the Black Panthers were, in a sense, they gave a certain glamour to bad faith. They were revolutionaries. They had broken faith with America. They had hijacked airplanes and flown to Algiers, and Algiers welcomed them as revolutionaries in a hotbed of revolutionaries. Well, I wanted to see that. I wanted to sort of say, is this an option? Is this a way to go in life? I was on the cusp. I was back and forth. Then one afternoon, we were sitting in the living room of the villa the government had given them. We were eating shrimp that came in baskets. It was the best shrimp I've ever had. And I became aware. Again, I grew up in Chicago. I was aware of, I had driven a city bus late at night. I was aware of how to judge people, how to see who you were with, and so forth, make those kinds of decisions. All the curtains were pulled. They would peek out. It was a beautiful, sunny Mediterranean afternoon, but no light could get in. And it occurred to me suddenly, these guys were thugs. They were just thugs, kind I had seen in my neighborhood all my life. They didn't have any glamorous intellectual insights. They were not. They had guns. Some of them had been charged with murder. No doubt some of them had committed murder. Others had hijacked airplanes. They were a dangerous lot. I remember taking my wife's hand and getting up, and a French teacher was coming in to give them a lesson. And I said, well, I don't want to interrupt your lesson. And we went downstairs, got a cab, went to the hotel, got our bags, took the same cab to the airport, and caught the first plane out of there. And make a very, very long story short, because we went to a bunch of other African countries, but to shorten that a bit, eventually I flew back to New York and signed up to go to graduate school, and felt that maybe America had made some profound mistakes, but I still had enough faith in it to bank my life on it, and to come back, and I knew that racism would still be here. There'd still be problems, but it was still a much better country for many, many reasons than others, than the alternatives. Well, bad faith is one effect, it seems to me, of this moral fall. The second effect is a profound loss of moral authority in America. You know, if you can think of, it's not complicated. You've heard it a million times. Here's the Founding Fathers writing some of the most glorious documents about human freedom ever written on a level, the biblical level, timeless. And many of them owned slaves. Many of them had relationships with slaves, had children with slaves. Jefferson, for example, who wrote, "All men are created equal." Well, the 60s fall made America accountable to this hypocrisy. And America began to lose the moral authority it needed to enforce its own best principles and values. And we have never, since that time, completely gained back the moral authority to ask difficult things of other Americans, of ourselves and of our fellow Americans. And so this is the second sort of effect, I think, that modern liberalism has brought to us. This breakdown in moral authority across the board. I give the example, when I was a kid and I was on the YMCA swimming team, parents would drive us to swim meets. There was a nice lady named Mrs. Slatt. Her son and I were good friends, and so she would always ask me to ride in the car with her to wherever it was that we were going. And so I would do that. And right away I could see her listening to the back seat. And I would say something like, "Well, I ain't got none." And she would say, "Shelby, what is that what kind of construction is that you just made?" And I obviously didn't know. That's a double negative. That means you ain't got none. That means you really have some. But more importantly than that, Shelby, if you go out in the world and you talk like that, you're not going to get anywhere. You can't do it. It's not possible. So next week there would be another lesson. This went on for 2 or 3 years. Sometimes I liked Mrs. Slatt, sometimes I hated her. But she had absolute, what I call cultural confidence in what she was asking this little black boy. Well, can you imagine a white woman today doing the same thing to a black child? You can hear what the reactions were. Oh my God, she's ruining his self-esteem, she's crushing him, she's insensitive to his right. I mean, it would just go on and on and on. The woman would I would have been without that help. She was helpful to me. She wanted to be helpful to me. And she loved elocution and that sort of thing, and she would insist on it. And 10 years later, after this, I was a senior in college. I was the president of the Black Student Union, and Martin Luther King had just been assassinated in 1968. And black students, we decided we were going to make a list of demands. We were going to take it to storm into the president's office and present him with it and demand that he meet all those demands. Well, we were scared to death, but we essentially did that. I tell a story in one book where I remember that I just without thinking, lit a cigarette. And as we were marching into the office, I realized I should get rid of this cigarette, but there was no ashtray. So I had to walk into the office with the cigarette. Ashes spilling on the president's rug. And then I had to confront him with our anger and our outrage at the way we had been treated at this nice little liberal arts college in Iowa. And I had to do all this with the cigarette ashes dropping on the floor. And I knew him to be a man of considerable rectitude, a strong man, not a wishy-washy fellow. And so I just thought he was going to let us have it. But he looked at me and he said, "Shelby, give me the list of demands." And he took the list of demands, he sat there and he checked them off, and he said, "Well, we'll give you that, we'll give you that, we'll give you that. We'll work on that one. I don't know if we got the money for that, but we'll get it. We'll work on that one." Gave us everything. What's the difference between him and Mrs. Slatt? Mrs. Slatt was before the fall. My college president, Dr. McCabe, was after the fall. He had no moral authority. He was working at a deficit of moral authority. He could not enforce the values and the principles that would help us as black students join the American mainstream. He couldn't do it. He was afraid for his institution. It was his bad luck to come after the fall. And again, we have this division. One example of this that interests me, I'm sure most of you know about the Daniel Patrick Moynihan's Moynihan Report that came out in 1963, I think it was. One of the best things ever done on black family, and the difficulties, the struggles, the problems, because it was just done forthrightly. Moynihan wrote out of a cultural confidence. Well, here's this, and if you do that, and you've got extended members of the family in and out and so forth, then the father figure is not there, and so forth, and this has this effect, and pretty routine. He had the bad luck to publish this book just as the fall was beginning, after the fall. And so, even though it was a great book, it was excoriated, disallowed, banned. The entire field of sociology stayed completely away from the subject for over 20 years. It was William Julius Wilson who finally began to do research in this area again. But of course, William Julius Wilson was black. And so he had the moral authority to do it. Moynihan did not. and his work has tragically been neglected, but it is good and stands up to this very day. Well, this is modern liberalism. One of my points, one of my feelings is that the problem America has is that we are now all functioning after the fall. We live in a society that, and have to function in it after this fall. Fallenness is a condition. It is an existential circumstance that we live in and have to contend with. In other words, it is a fate. It is America's fate. It was in the waiting for a long time. It finally came in the 60s, and we've dealt with it, and it affected everything we do and think since that time. And we no longer, again, have that sort of cultural confidence. We function out of a vivid knowledge of past sins combined with a terror of being judged for those sins. And so the problem with that is that the truth is the only thing that's not acceptable. Reality is the only thing that's not allowed to be articulated. You can be as fancy as you want on one side or the other, but you cannot say the truth. One, it seems to me, recent example of this fallenness is the NFL situation, where on the one hand you have players who are showing bad faith by not showing bad faith in the American flag in America and not standing up and showing it proper respect. And on the other hand, you have owners of football teams who lack the moral authority to do anything about it, to demand that the players respect the flag. They don't have the moral authority to do that. And so we come to an impasse. What's the resolution of this? Nobody really knows. No one has any idea. But blacks are now, as I'll mention in a minute, bad faith has become central to our identity as black people. And so to kneel and not stand before the flag is to, again, assert our black identity, and which is bad faith. And the owners, who are not black, again, don't have the moral authority to say anything in the world about it. They're like Dr. McCabe. They roll over and give in. Well, we keep having this pattern of rolling over. As the years and the decades pass, one thing after another, and you look up, and the American education system is wiped out. Before the fall, it's pretty damn good. My teachers were all like Mrs. Slatt. We're gonna diagram sentences today. They're not like that anymore, and things get worse and worse. In this sort of state of fallenness, some corruption, I suppose, is inevitable. And here again, we see, I think, modern liberalism joining the arc of Madame Bovary, her story. To avoid the challenges of reality, liberalism goes to the realm of empty idealisms, as she tried to escape her own sense of despair and so forth, with sort of dreams of perfection and so forth. Liberalism has done that in America, has generated all sorts of utterly empty and incoherent yet charming idealisms. Integration, multiculturalism, pluralism, social justice, inclusion, globalism, and that most common of all, diversity. What are any of them? What do they mean? What is inclusion? What is that? How do you do that? What really is diversity? Well, they have no purpose other than to bring to a beleaguered society, a society that is injured moral authority, a cheap turn of phrase that brings you moral authority. I support inclusion. Aren't you a wonderful person? I'm for diversity, and I'm against microaggressions. I can remember living in a time when you would long for some microaggressions. Well, we saw it, I think, very tragically in Chicago recently. Last year in Chicago, 2016, over 4,000 people were shot with guns. Over 860 some were killed 1 year in 5 neighborhoods on the south side of Chicago where I grew up. Now, when I grew up there, I never saw a gun. Ever. They may have been there. I don't know. I didn't see any. I lived there. Well, that's a serious, deep problem of a people almost self-immolating. And there are many complex sources of a problem like that, that sort of willful, nihilistic self-destruction. And what does the mayor do? He puts forward a resolution to have Chicago declared a sanctuary city. Sanctuary city. Well, that's modern liberalism. Again, the gimmickry, to get back to chase moral authority through these silly little devices. Liberalism, I think, has effectively become the new racism. It mimics segregation by seeing blacks as helpless inferiors. Black inferiority is its greatest sort of cause, its greatest raison d'etre. And it has, again, tended to hide reality behind empty idealisms in a way that that belittles blacks, that keeps them down, it debilitates them. It literally demands dependency from them. It asks them to act out and live inferiority, racial inferiority. And as blacks climb out of inferiority and become visibly equal, they become suspect, maybe a little Uncle Tomish. We like to say that the real black is the black who's on the street corner and doing drugs and selling drugs and shooting each other. And we don't question their blackness, but we question the blackness of those blacks who climb out of those situations, who join the American mainstream, who become successful, who identify themselves primarily. And so this liberalism rewards failure and perpetuates it. It breeds bad faith in people and bad faith in America. But again, I think maybe the worst thing that it does is that it defines the Black American identity as, again, an identity grounded and focused and defined by bad faith in the United States of America. And if you want to be black, you have to have this bad faith today. You cannot have good faith. And we blacks look at each other in that way. And if we think that somebody is somehow has less than bad faith, then we withhold their identity from them. We marginalize them. And so the more and more inferior you are, the more black you are. That's the sort of cultural pattern, the cultural dynamic that we live by. Well, I still have some good faith in America. I'm probably not black. And I have this good faith for one reason. As an American black today, I, like all blacks, am absolutely free. I'm free. When I was born, I wasn't. I'm free. I can do anything I want. I can, from the top to the bottom, all in between, it's up to me. I am free. And the breaking news here is precisely that our oppression is over. It's just over. We can't organize ourselves any longer to fighting against society that doesn't want us to be free. The society today wants us to be free. Maybe they love us, maybe they don't, but they want us to be free. And that is a revolutionary change, transformation, probably only possible in the United States. But we are now free. The problem that we have as blacks, as minorities, is what I call the shock of freedom. It is a shock. The fantasy when you don't have it is that it's paradise, and all stresses will be relieved, and your happiness will befall you. The reality is, responsibility comes with freedom. You now are responsible for your own fate. You don't have anybody to blame. You don't have any excuses to make. You can do whatever you want. You can, if you have children, you can raise them to become whatever they want. You can chase the American dream in any form that you would like to consider doing so. But how do the problem that we have is, as blacks, is what do we do with freedom? We faced and overcame every single problem a human group can have. Exorbitant centuries of dehumanizing oppression. We survived that. But we never had freedom. We don't know. We have no experience with freedom. And we still imagine ourselves as less than free. So all the tension, the whole struggle around race is that no, there's still a little bit of right over there behind the curtain. You can't see it. It's there. Take my word for it. As if the world, before I act as a free man, I have to wait for every little shred of racism to be eliminated. I don't even care if people are racist. I care if you discriminate against me. Then we go to war. But we're free. And that's the most revolutionary thing you can say today. And you certainly will get in trouble for it. But the challenge for Black America today is we have to completely reconceive, reimagine our ourselves in the world, our fate in the world. We have to reinvent ourselves as people who can deal with freedom, who can use it, can exploit it, cannot be intimidated by it. People who have lived that way all their life take that for granted. Born doing that. But for minorities that have been, that is in fact, it's not, and no one's to blame here. It's a manifestation of centuries of oppression that you don't know how to deal with. Yes, that you were kept away from that, from freedom above all else. So you're going to have a lot of difficulty now learning how to handle. You have to build and raise individuals from birth on who think of being themselves out of a sense of responsibility for themselves, who educate themselves, who erect in their lives a structure that's going to enable them to handle being free, so that they can succeed in freedom rather than fail in it. Because the minute you fail, you go back to all those idealisms, all those corruptions, microaggressions. That's where you go. Microaggressions. Because you don't know how. You can't go forward because you don't know, you can't, because you don't know how to. We knew better how to go forward in freedom when I grew up in a segregated world than we do today. The segregationist, bless his heart, said, "You're on your own. I don't like you. I'm never going to like you. Now you don't come around me." But you were still in possession of yourself and of your life. And many, 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 many blacks did phenomenal things, as we all know, who took charge of their lives, acted as free men even when they weren't. Today we have complete, total, we got something on the other side of freedom. A society that's just rolling over, tearing itself to pieces to accommodate us. And we don't know what to do with it. And we're afraid. You scared the hell out of us. That TV show that from the 90s, In Living Color, they always had an episode where this black who still thought slavery was in place, and so he'd sneak away, hide behind bushes, and so forth, and then a black would come down the street with a suit on, a briefcase, going to work, and the slave would say, "Come here, man, get back behind here, they're going to see you." They're going to see you, well, all will be lost. I always thought that was incredibly prescient humor, really funny. And it gets to the psychology. The slave had no way to conceive of himself, would not know himself without the idea of his victimization being central to him. Black America today does not know itself outside of victimization. Doesn't know itself. Every single thing, you have to pay tribute to black victimization. Well, I was going to have a cute ending here with Madame Bovary. She is a cautionary tale. Her mistake was to be seduced by all the charms of idealism, and so she missed reality. She missed the woman who lives next door to, is very common, hardworking, helps her husband in his business as a pharmacist, raises their children, cooks for the bread and breakfast place they run, who has found happiness and meaning in the ordinary, in the same village that Madame Bovary finds despair in. Well, again, my point is that we have run away from freedom. Freedom is our fate now. There's nothing, we can't, as blacks, we can't escape freedom now. We're just in it. It's here. We can't get away from it, and we won't be humiliated anymore by white racism. We will be humiliated in the future by our failure to adapt to freedom. Thank you. Thank you. Yes.
You lost me a little bit on talking about the white that you can't adapt to freedom, because when blacks were freed, there was, correct me if I'm wrong, tremendous progress. There was a first, Madam Walker, first black millionaire, and Black America had created, I think, hundreds of newspapers and all these things that are now gone. So are you saying because they were technically free but still segregated?
Yes.
Okay, that's why?
Yes, they were still segregated and disallowed from joining the mainstream. But again, they took the little margin of freedom they had and did great things with it. Created, as you say, newspapers, all sorts of businesses, and so forth. But they did that in a segregated world. We're not even segregated anymore.
But so I guess I'm a little confused as to how, if they could do that with having freedom but in their own environment, then why did that not translate into, when segregation was eradicated? Because
I think we got, distracted by the power we found in our victimization. The society around us, white America, got down on its knees. The president on down began to figure out ways, like my college president I mentioned, figure out ways to give us things, whether they made sense or not. He gave us school busing. School busing wiped out the school system. But you're going to have it. You're going to have affirmative action. Doesn't work, you're going to have it. So we're sitting there saying, well, wow, I don't have to face the rigor, the difficulty of freedom if I'm going to get all of this through being a victim. And so we look at each other and then we say, you better act like a victim too. And so we reinforce this idea of helplessness, that we can't, we're helpless and we can't make it, we can't do it. Yes?
Thank you. So who, in your opinion, is the best person or the best group to generally articulate everything that you've been saying here? Because you can't just be one voice in the wilderness. There's got to be a lot of people saying
Sure you can.
And seemingly, sorry about that, but seemingly very few people are saying it. Who out there in political life now do you think is the best messenger?
I think we've come to a period in Black America where we have a vacuum of leaders. We don't have any Martin Luther Kings anymore, W.E.B. Du Bois, Frederick Douglass, or figures who sort of represent the race to the larger world. Frankly, I hope that's over with. That's a weak, beleaguered, victimized group that has to produce this sort of Christ-like figure to lead them forward through the wilderness and so forth. The fact that we don't have any distinct black leadership today is a measure of how free we are. It's a result of the fact that we're free to do whatever we want to do. What would we need one for? We would need one to tell us, you're free. We would need one to stop wasting his time hammering away at white people. Why? Where's that going to get you? Turn yourself into something. Become something. Become somebody. Put all your energies there. The politics of race are not necessary anymore because all whites could ever possibly ensure for us throughout history is that they could finally let us have freedom, which they've done. No one can develop you after you're free. You have to do that yourself. Maybe that's not fair. Well, we've put you down for centuries, and so you're weak, and you're undereducated, and you're under so forth and so on. You're not assimilated, you know, but the world is not fair. It's not fair. You still are responsible for making yourself into something. And if you don't do it, you can't blame that on white people and think that that somehow gives you a self-esteem. No, it won't.
Thank you so much for being here this morning. As a black conservative, your words are very refreshing and inspiring, and I'm very thankful to have been able to sit here this morning and hear you speak. Thank you very much.
Thank you, thank you.
I think you did an outstanding job beautifully and eloquently articulating the problem that is not only problems within the black community, but I also think, you know, in the conservative movement, there's not enough individuals of color on this side of the aisle. So what I'm wondering is you laid out the problem, but what's the answer? What can we do as conservatives to bring more people of color in, and what can I do as a black conservative in speaking with other blacks and, you know, trying to help break this mental constraint?
Well, I don't think there's any magic answers to that. That's a very good question. I've wondered that for many, many years. But you know, I don't like to believe in magic. You know, I think it's a hard fight with other blacks. I think discussions, confrontations, just talking to Mr. Woodson here about a project that he's working on, involved in, where there's a dialogue back and forth between us and the black community about these very issues. You know, again, one thing I think we need to make over and over and over and over and over again the point that we're free. That's what we have completely sidestepped and avoided, and whites have enabled us in avoiding it. Whites need to say, "You're free." Now, if you don't take advantage of that, then what can we do? But you know, that's what freedom is what black conservatives have to offer other blacks. Is this reality that we are free now, and so we can now envision ourselves. We can talk about things like child rearing. How do you raise children to be effective in a modern, high-tech, deeply competitive world? Being black is not going to do anything for you in that world. You're going to have skills and talents. You're going to have a whole system of principles and values. You're going to have. We have to develop an intellectual component. God knows that's what oppression did for 4 centuries, was try to keep us away from all of that. Well, now we have to make up that ground, and you know, any sort of vehicle or means by which we can take that message to other blacks, I think we just have to keep fighting, and struggling to do that. I'm very glad to look and see somebody as young as you on this side of the fence, which I see as reality. This is reality. Yes.
The fall, as you say, a critical. Thank you, Paul Mirengoff. The fall, as you say, took place in the 60s, and at that time there were these outrageous manifestations, the Black Panthers, the riots, the thuggery, the hijacking. And then, although the fall had an ongoing erosive effect, that seemed to subside. And now, in the last few years, we seem to be getting back towards that with the Black Lives Matter movement. Is that just frustration with failure to cope with freedom? What do you attribute if you agree with me that there
Yes.
is this. What do you attribute that
Yes.
to?
My favorite writer in the world is V.S. Naipaul. I don't know if many of you know who he is, but he is a breathtaking, deep writer. One point he makes, again, when you don't know how to go forward, you go backward. Black Lives Matter is nothing other than an indication of probably earnest young people who don't know how to go forward in freedom, who don't know anything about freedom, who are terrified of it because it shames them. The first thing when you embrace freedom, freedom is going to make you see how small you are and how underprepared you are and how much you have to have heart and overcome. And so rather than face the fact that you're a college freshman and you're probably got in when you're probably reading at about an 8th grade level, you say instead, Black Lives Matters for me. I'm a victim here. This campus is not hospitable to me. And now you're in a comfort zone. And Black Lives Matter is a comfort zone where people land because they're afraid of freedom. Yes.
I just wonder if liberalism that you're describing has gone too far now with the anti-Americanism, if this is in some way an opportunity for those of us on the conservative side to make a new appeal, to make new entree into people who weren't listening before to ideas, that maybe that is just a bridge too far.
That, oh, you mean that people will see that and say that's too much? One hopes so, but you know, one hopes so. And you have to sort of believe ultimately, yes. But it was stunning to me to realize that the bad faith that was created in this fall led to this idea that bad faith in America was virtue itself. It was deliverance. It was progressivism. So if and it is ever so chic in many quarters today in America to be anti-American, to say, oh gosh, we try to dominate, the whole litany of the liberal rhetoric, we dominate the world, we want to have wars everywhere, we have American evil, we're racist, we're sexist, and that's America. And I hate that America. It is amazing to see how culture can twist things around so that being anti-American is to be moral and virtuous. Okay.
Thank you. I was wondering if this idea of bad faith and loss of moral confidence, the story you've been telling is peculiar to America, but it seems to me like it's a phenomenon in all industrialized liberal countries. You see this in Europe
Yes.
with their confrontation with radical Islam, for example, their inability to confront it. So doesn't that mean that this is maybe less about America's particular sins and about the fact than something about liberalism, and I mean classical liberalism itself?
I don't think it's about classical liberalism. I think it is, I think America is just a paradigm. Yet you see exactly the same thing in Europe. Remember, Europe had colonies. They were ruthless in those colonies. They raped and pillaged. They subjugated those. They just like America. So I think this liberalism, you see it everywhere across the Western world. You know, this moralistic, bad faith liberalism is in London. They hate the British Empire. It's just all across, I think, the entire Western world.
What I meant was that if perhaps the reason for the fall is that liberalism raises expectations about what politics can offer you, which it can't fulfill. more freedom, I mean, absolute freedom, absolute equality. And so inevitably, you're going to be disappointed by that. And that's what we see for the fall.
And that's what?
And that's the reason for this fall, as you describe it.
Well, you know, liberalism is guaranteed to absolutely 100% fail.
Exactly.
Guaranteed. It already has. You look at one big social program after another, and look at school busing. That's just, you know, your mouth hangs open. How could you be that stupid? And yet we plotted 30 years. But I think the fall was, again, the fact that you have in your society, in your midst, millions of people who can say, you're evil, and you're in denial about it, and I'm suffering because of it. That moral power has been enormous, and it has been ruinous. It is ruining the Western world across the board. And we've got to get up. Everybody, how do we get out of this? How do we get it? The only way I know, and I'm limited here, but the only way I know is courage. White people have to be courageous and say, damn it, you are free. Black people have to say, you are free. This is not a racist country. This country has bent over backward, has struggled with itself like human beings have never in history done before. Self-examination. Tried to root out looked at everything. They should get some credit for that. Thank you very much. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Our program concludes. I would encourage you to read Shelby's books, and if you're millennials and you don't read books, the gateway drug is his Wall Street Journal op-eds, which are absolutely fantastic. Thank you, Shelby.